Okay, along with the critical thinking skills, logical fallacies, a way of looking at the problems that we're going to do, or at least the information that we're going to discuss in this course, or you're going to read through and write about. Having this viewpoint, I mentioned this already in the last lecture a little bit, so I won't go into great depth here. I'll try to keep this video fairly short, about holism and reductionism. Okay, holism is this viewpoint. Again, I mentioned this before. Is we're looking at the picture in its entirety. So in this case, like an engine, a car engine. You may not be familiar with car engines. That's fine. I'm not that familiar with them either, to be honest with you. I know some of the things about it, but not a whole lot. But an engine works based on its parts, right? And so many times in what's a very common thing to do in modern research, and you guys are going to read eventually, when we talk about scientism, you're going to read an article that looks at some of the issues associated with modern science leading to scientism, is that we tend to boil things down into very small components so we can better understand them. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, think about your anatomy class that you took or taking. You have to understand how the digestive system works first, and even inside that concept of digestive system, all the different organs that are associated with it, and then deeper still, how our peristalsis works, right? Now you're down to microvilli, and now you're down to brush border enzymes, and now, right, you're getting deeper and deeper, and you're getting smaller and smaller. Okay, and to the point where you try to reduce things down to the smallest components that we can understand, because then we can say, well, now we understand how digestion works. Now, the trick is and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, because that's how you have to understand things initially, is then to zoom back out, right? It's to say, okay, I understand a brush border enzyme, but now let's look at that in a bigger picture, back to peristalsis, right? Back to the small intestine, or the duodenum, back to the small intestine, right? And then back into the whole digestive tract, and then back into the whole body, okay? The tendency many times in modernity is to focus too long with too much attention reduction. As I mentioned before, like mental health issues, counseling and medications potentially, or both, they can be very helpful. But if we don't address the root causes, which I realize is what counseling many times is about, but even further before that, are there situations that modernity has created in ways of thinking that have led to an increase in the need for counseling, right? That's kind of more of a holistic approach. So we're not saying that the reductionist approach is bad, or I'm not saying that, nor is that approach bad in trying to deal with problems. But if we're going to deal with a problem, in its entirety and to its completion, we need to view it holistically as well. Okay, so as we think through this holistic versus reductionist type of viewpoint, just some questions like if we look at this engine. So if I modify one piece of the engine, will that affect how the whole engine runs? So if I took one of the, you may not know what a valve is, but let's say a piston, maybe you know what that is. And I built the piston out of a different material. Maybe I made it lighter, and so the piston moves faster, but it was just one piston. Will that affect how the engine runs? Well, yeah, maybe negatively, because the other pistons are not the same. Maybe the other parts of the engine, if you're not familiar with the other parts like the crankshaft, things like that, they can't handle that pace anymore. Maybe it blows the engine up, okay? Or maybe it causes it to run better, all right? But in order to fully appreciate the change in one part's effect on the machine, you have to put it back in the machine and look at it, how it runs. Okay, and you might be thinking, why are we getting an automotive lecture? I'm talking about complexity here. Why are we getting an automotive lecture in this class about wellness? Because this is I just alluded to just a little bit ago, and I'll try not to talk in circles here, is many times we focus on the part. How can we make the part better? I'm going to go back to the mental health example. How can we make counseling better? Nothing wrong with counseling. Please don't misunderstand me. But how can we make it better instead of saying, how can we avoid people even going to counseling? Okay, and that, again, that's just one example here. We're going to tackle each week some of these questions from modernity. Like, is there an impact of modernity on mental health? Well, that's for you guys to wrestle with as I present some of the information in the class for you to read and to wrestle with. Think about, again, complexity. How can I understand the engine without taking it apart? That's tough, right? So I mentioned this before, like in education, how do you understand the digestive system if I can't look down on the smallest pieces? So, again, reductionism isn't bad per se. It's just if we stay there. I'm going to keep saying that over and over. If I remove one piece of the engine, will it run? Maybe. Depends on the part. We have to figure that out. Okay. If you remove some of the pistons or one of the pistons, it could run. It just won't run well, right? If you remove the coolant system, it could run, but it won't run long, right? There may be parts that you won't see the effects for that for a long period of time. Okay, and it's the same thing when we think about modernity and its effects on the well-being of people now. There may be some things that changes in modernity, maybe 200 years ago, which really in the timeline of history is not very long, that took a little bit longer to flesh out and its impact on people today. There may be other things that were more abrupt. That was the obvious change, and that changed how the engine run. It changed how, when I'm saying the engine, maybe here, and this is where the analogy isn't perfect, but how people think, how a community operates, how a culture changes, whatever it may be. Okay? Can I say one piece of the engine is more important than the other or others? I don't know, right? And that's, as we look through these different revolutions, I kind of mentioned this before in the last lecture, is there one revolution that impacts physical wellness more than the others? Maybe, I don't know. And that's when we need to start to identify. That's how we're going to think critically about these issues. We can't say the Industrial Revolution ruined the wellness of all humans. Or it was maybe beneficial. It's like, well, even if there is a kind of a global negative impact, global meaning like the whole person's wellness, personal wellness, maybe there was, where this was most impactful. Perhaps it was in financial or the physical, right, or the social or whatever it may be. Perhaps that is where there was the most impact, and that entry point is where we saw the negative impact of this event, or again, this revolution, and the example of the Industrial Revolution, start to make its significant impact on the wellness of an individual, or it could be an impact of wellness of a nation or a community group. Okay, so this lecture is about just looking at, again, another one of these ways of thinking about things. How are we thinking about a problem? Okay, there's obviously limitations to my analogy here with the engine. I've already noted one of them, so it's not a perfect example, but I'm just trying to show you the importance of complexity. Here's another example briefly as we finish this lecture: modern medicine, right? So modern medicine, under modernity, we have a lot of specialists. Okay? You have an endocrinologist, you have a cardiologist, you have a rheumatologist, you have a radiologist, you have a pathologist, right? And those are all valuable skills. This is what modernity is borne out in higher education. Back to that higher education, we've built vocationally trained individuals who are brilliant folks like yourself that are going to be specialists. There's nothing wrong with being a specialist by that. I'm not knocking that. But what's the limitation now of this kind of reductionist specialist approach is that you view everything through that lens. So if a cardiologist, for the most part, will view all problems through the lens of cardiology. So everything's a cardiology problem, at least initially, right? I'm painting with a big brush here. I realize that there's a lot of cardiologists don't think this way, and that's what I'm going to lead to next, is that there has been this growth in integrative medicine. This is a good thing. So this could be a solution to the problem of specialization, and maybe at least in terms of higher education, okay, we're going to acknowledge that we're going to produce highly qualified but very much specialized individuals out into the career fields, out into occupation. But we're going to make them talk to each other. So we're going to integrate them. So a cardiologist doesn't view everything through cardiology. He might talk to, or she might talk to the endocrinologist, and he or she then would say, hey, you know what, I don't think this is a cardiology problem. This may be an endocrinology problem, or maybe it's both, which is probably more likely. Okay. These are good things that can develop. But where we have been for a long time is a siloed approach to medicine. Okay. And that's more of a reductionist view, right? It follows along with the research literature. Many problems are presented in the research literature as reductionist. Looking at some of the nursing practice literature, it's just hard to also describe it. So to say, the care that a nurse provides isn't all related to pharmacology, obviously. A lot of that is human interaction. That's very difficult to measure. But if you just boil it down to pharmacology, you miss out on the real contribution of nursing. And that's the person-to-person interactions as well. Okay, so to sum up, one thing about these topics in this course, the reason we even have this little lecture here on reduction versus holism, is that you're using both. You're getting that phone example again, zooming in and zooming out on these questions. Zooming in close, it's not a binary choice. It's not a dichotomous choice. Like, I should always view things reductionistically. I should always view, this is a trap too, view things only in the holistic manner. Okay? And ignoring some of the things we know about, specific topics. All right? But when we're trying to address the wellness of a modern and think about the impact of modernity, we have to use both of these. Okay? And not just focus again on the leaf. I'm using lots of analogies, I realize. I hope this is helpful. Maybe it's just redundant at this point. But focusing on the leaf rather than the whole tree, and more specifically the roots of these issues. All right, so I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page with what holism versus reductionism is. And while they're not good or bad per se, but this class is focused a little bit more on the holism side, which may be a little bit different than we attack problems traditionally in modernity.